But I don't think they realized James Harden was as good as he is now, right?
That's correct. To be fair, I don't know if anyone did. We put all our assets in to trade for him, but no one could anticipate he'd be the best player in the world. Like,
Why did you put all your assets? Why him?
So both the eye test, because he looks amazing. I think anyone watched him, but if you looked at data at the time, once he had the ball in his hands, and it's still true to this day, and I get a lot of shit because someone asked me who's a better scorer, him or Michael Jordan, and it's just factual that James Harden is a better scorer than Michael Jordan.
Based on the math.
Based on literally, like, you give James Harden the ball, and before you're giving up the ball, how many points do you generate, which is how you should measure offense. James Harden is by far number one in NBA history, and he was number one even at the Oklahoma City Thunder. He was coming off the bench. It was a little more hidden. So you needed good data to sort of suss that out.
All right, this is probably one of my more interesting videos that I have to make, because typically whenever I see trade rumors like this, especially in the midst of the NBA playoffs, I tend to ignore them, but this one seems to be fairly legitimate because it actually makes a lot of sense if you think about it. Now, before we get started, guys, comment down below the probability that you think the Philadelphia 76ers could sign both Mike D'Antoni and trade for James Harden. I know it's pretty up there, but it's pretty logical if you think about it. And also, we're giving away a PS5 on my Twitter account. I'm going to leave a link to that in the description down below. You get a bonus entry if you follow me on Twitch, which I really highly suggest you do. I don't know if you guys were there last night, but pretty much my good friend Flight Reacts got his account hacked, and, well, let's just say it resulted in a very interesting live stream where we try to help him get it back. You could go onto my Twitter account. You'll see some nice little snippets and highlights of that scenario. I'd include it in this video, but I don't want to get demonetized. And of course, if you are new to the channel and you find yourself clicking on my videos a lot, please take a moment to subscribe and smash that like button, because eventually, not now, but this happened to me last year, the NBA will go on some sort of claiming spree, claiming all my content, and it gets a little scary. But if you have enough subscribers, you can pretty much provide an argument that your channel's way too valuable to consistently claim the content. So yeah, if you want to help me out, go ahead and subscribe. Now that we got all that out of the way, cue the intro. Mic check 1 2 1 2. What's going on, everybody? Guys, the Houston Rockets and the Philadelphia 76ers have one thing in common, and that's the fact that every single year they have these crazy lofty expectations to make a deep run to the NBA Finals or in the NBA playoffs, and for the most part, the argument is there for them to be able to do so. If you asked me in the beginning of the season, I thought there was no reason why the Philadelphia 76ers couldn't make that deep run. They had a head coach in Brett Brown that was tenured for a pretty long time, comes from the Greg Popovich coaching tree, so that's a head coach I could trust. They have an up-and-coming star in Ben Simmons. They have Joel Embiid, who's definitely like a top 3 center in the NBA, in my opinion. There's no reason that they can't make it. And then, of course, they did lose Jimmy Butler, but hey, they went and they signed Al Horford instead. And hey, they also brought back Tobias Harris. And who cares if they lost probably one of the greatest shooters in our generation in JJ Redick? Who needs him anyway? There's a good chance they could have made a run. It's the Eastern Conference is weak, for crying out loud. The star player that knocked them out of the playoffs last year is no longer there this year. So there's a good reason they can make it. And then you go on the flip side, you look at the Western Conference playoff picture, and you have the Houston Rockets, and you think to yourself, okay, James Harden and CP3 were able to almost do it in 2017 to 2018. They were literally within a CP3 injury away of making it to the NBA Finals that year. But of course, CP3 got injured. James Harden and CP3 didn't get along very well the year after. And hey, if you swap Chris Paul for a good old buddy of James Harden's, maybe you'll be able to make a deep run in the NBA playoffs, and that's what they tried to do. And of course, that turned out to be disastrous. Both teams turned out to be disastrous. The Al Horford signing was disastrous. The Russell Westbrook trade was disastrous. And that's not to hate on Al Horford, who, by the way, is turning 35 and is still being paid a max contract for the next 3 years. Shout out to Elton Brand, who, by the way, you traded Markelle Fultz for nothing. I just want to remind you of that. And at the same time, you have Russell Westbrook, who just isn't a good fit for a team that emphasizes the three-point shot. He shot about 26% from three this year, and for his career, if he shoots 30% from three, that's a good year for him. And that's nothing against Russell Westbrook. I love him, but that's the case. So here's the situation that the Houston Rockets are currently in. Mike D'Antoni said that there's no way that he's returning, which means there's about to be a culture shift in Houston. I don't know if the departure of Mike D'Antoni is also going to be followed by a departure of Daryl Morey, considering what happened with him and the Hong Kong situation. But if there's one thing that I am pretty confident in, it's there's going to be a plethora of roster transactions for the Houston Rockets and for the Philadelphia 76ers, because both teams are definitely not in a position to compete the way they are right now. But there's one intriguing rumor that was brought to my attention that at first I was like, okay, this isn't going to happen. But when I thought about it, it kind of made some sense. You see, while a lot of Houston Rocket fans want the team to trade Russell Westbrook, you have to understand that if you were to trade Russell Westbrook after what Russell Westbrook has been going through, and after everyone seeing the holes in Russell Westbrook's game, especially for the modern NBA, you're not going to get much for him. As a matter of fact, you'd probably have to give up draft picks in order to get rid of him because you have to pay him so much money as well. I can't think of a contending team that'll look at Russell Westbrook and say, hey, if we bring Russell Westbrook, we will win a championship. That's nothing against Russell Westbrook, but you're talking about a player that wasn't able to win a championship in his earlier years when he had Kevin Durant, Serge Ibaka, and James Harden on the roster. He wasn't able to win a championship when him and Kevin Durant were in their respective primes together. He wasn't able to win a championship when him and Paul George were on a team together, including Carmelo Anthony and without Carmelo Anthony, because they said Carmelo was the problem. And he wasn't able to do much when it was just him and James Harden. So it's nothing against Russell Westbrook. I love him. I love the way he plays. I love the grit and his drive. It's just his stock isn't really what it used to be at this point, especially as a 31-year-old player with a max contract that hasn't had much playoff success. So trading Russell Westbrook isn't the move in my opinion, and I'm sure we could all agree. However, a player whose stock is at an all-time high, probably as one of the top three players, or probably the top two players that you could get a ridiculous return for, and I'm not saying top two or top three in the NBA in terms of skill, but I'm saying teams would pay top dollar for this individual, is James Harden. And the reason is simple. James Harden is still breaking statistics. He still has a 29 player efficiency rating. He still is averaging 34 points per game, 7 rebounds per game, and 7 assists per game. He's still shooting 45% from the field and 36% from three and 87% from free throw. Pretty much, James Harden is still a glitchy offensive player. A team will look at James Harden and say, hey, if we bring in James Harden and allow him to shoot mid-range jumpers, there's a good chance that we could win a championship. And while I do think it's kind of a long shot for a team to look at another team and say, hey, we should poach his head coach and star player, it makes sense for both sides, for the Sixers to pursue a James Harden trade and for the Rockets to trade James Harden to the Sixers and to move on from this era altogether. According to John Clark, which is someone I saw on Twitter, I saw this reported on Bleacher Report as well, which is what led me to make this video. John Clark said that I'm hearing one of the reasons, along with coaching, that Sixers have a lot of interest in Mike D'Antoni is feeling with some in organization that he could help lure James Harden to Philly. Harden can become a free agent in 2 years, and there is a possibility of a trade. So pretty much the Rockets are in this window where they could trade James Harden before James Harden demands a trade, while James Harden is a superstar, while James Harden is viewed as this untradeable individual that nobody would ever conceive of moving on from. Right before, a good 3 to 4 years before, and maybe even less, before he starts to decline a little bit, before the holes in his game become apparent. And James Harden will probably be very interested in such a move because he's never had more success with any head coach than Mike D'Antoni. And why the Sixers would be fascinated by this is they're pretty much missing one important piece in their roster, and that's a guy that, well, we know Ben Simmons is a great playmaker, but is one a playmaker that could also shoot the three ball. Sorry, Ben, I didn't really mean to go at your personal brand like that. And is also a player that they could depend on in those go-to clutch situations, which I think, at least in the regular season, James Harden seems to be the part, but that's my opinion over there. Now, in order to get a player like James Harden, I'm assuming that the Sixers will have to find a trade partner to take on Al Horford's salary, and they would have to depart with either Joel Embiid or Ben Simmons. Now, it's really hard for me to pick between the two who I would keep because there's an argument for both players. If you keep Joel Embiid, well, you have a center that is phenomenal at shooting the three, but Mike D'Antoni tried to go away from the center position altogether this year. But if you have Ben Simmons, and again, this is not to hate against Ben Simmons, I think he has tremendous potential, but Ben Simmons is pretty much Russell Westbrook in a different body, you know, in the sense that he's phenomenal at slashing to the rim. He's remarkable at transition. He's really good at finding his teammates, and I think Russell is probably a little bit better at finishing than Ben is. But Ben really struggles to hit the open three, and that's going to be a problem in Mike D'Antoni's offense. And if we saw what happened with Russell Westbrook in Mike D'Antoni's offense, it's pretty much going to happen to Ben Simmons again. You know, let's not ignore what's glaringly obvious. So in terms of systematic fit, if you want to bring in James Harden, you probably want to give up Ben Simmons, which is fine because I feel like the Rockets would probably be higher on Ben Simmons than Joel Embiid anyways, and then you're probably going to have to give up a boatload of picks to make this work. But it makes a lot of sense. The Rockets get to move on from James Harden and probably sell him at his all-time peak. This is probably the highest point that you could sell James Harden, right before he becomes a free agent in 2 years, right as he's playing really well, right before he even demands a trade. He's not even saying that he wants to get out of Houston. You get a tremendous return for him right before he's going to hit his decline. You literally got 8 good years, probably James Harden's best years, and you're getting to move on from him. So if they did pull the trigger on this trade, I would actually have a lot of respect for the Houston Rockets. The question is, how much would the Sixers be willing to give up in order to make it happen? Hey, Sixers, I bet you wish you kept Markelle Fultz right now because, hey, he's considered to be an asset in my opinion. The only thing that's holding this back, like this entire theory back, is literally the fact that the Philadelphia 76ers have absolutely no assets. And as a matter of fact, in order to make the trade work, you'd have to give up Tobias Harris and Ben Simmons because Ben Simmons technically didn't have his contract extension kick in yet. And then on top of that, if you're the Rockets and you're looking at the Sixers, there's not really much on the Sixers that would really excite me, aside from Matisse Thybulle and Furkan Korkmaz and maybe Shake Milton. But you see, it's nothing really too exciting because they're very top-heavy, and their top-heavy players aren't really that great, in my opinion. So it's kind of shaky in that sense, in the sense that the trade makes sense for both sides. It's just, in order to make this work, the Sixers, which, by the way, I think they're perfectly capable of doing this based off of how I've been watching Elton Brand conduct trades, they'd probably have to give up like multiple first-round picks in the future, kind of like what Sam Presti's doing. And hell, I think the Sixers are perfectly capable of doing that. Like, that Markelle Fultz trade was horrific. Signing Tobias Harris to that big of an extension was also horrific. Signing Al Horford out of nowhere to clog up the paint was horrific. Letting Brett Brown go and blaming him for the team not being successful was also horrific. So, in my opinion, I'm really sorry. I don't mean to completely insult the Sixers, but until further notice, I'm going to assume Elton Brand's a terrible general manager. So he's perfectly capable of mortgaging the Sixers' future, giving up multiple first-round picks in the future in order to get a player that is turning 31, that probably has 3 good years left in him or 4 good years left in him, in order to somehow scrap together a roster to hopefully win a championship. So let me know in the comment section down below what you think about this rumor. At the end of the day, it is a rumor. It makes sense, but it also doesn't make sense. Aside from that, I'm your boy, TheFlightMike, and I'm dropping our mic until the next upload.